From reworked and cut Pokemon, scrapped weather effects, and the game's changing their marketing in response to legal threats. Let's take a look at 13 fascinating facts about Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. There were many reworked and scrapped Pokemon. As we have explored in previous entries in our Pokemon Facts series, a lot of Pokemon are cut before the final releases of the games. But did you know the community didn't know about this for close to 20 years? For a number of years, the community has been aware of concept drawings for Pokemon such as Torchic with a much rounded design, Trico with a much more gecko-like design, this Groudon, and what appears to be a cross between Latias and Blaziken. However, a lot of the cut Pokemon for Ruby and Sapphire were undiscovered for close to 20 years. In May of 2020, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire source code was leaked, which revealed changes to map designs, scrap mechanics such as weather, we will get to this, don't worry, along with a bunch of unused Pokemon. Unfortunately though, sprites for these Pokemon were never found in the source code as they were most likely deleted, but we do have access to their Pokédex entries. The source code is taken from February and May of 2002 and reveals plans for a water-type Pokemon with leaves for hands, which was possibly reworked for Shiftry, a bug psychic-type Pokemon based on the red spider Lilyflower, and an electric-type Pokemon that could absorb electricity from lightning. All this information and more is available from our friends at the CuttingRoomFloor, so be sure after the video to check out the description to view all the lost Pokédex entries. Player character names referencing the themes for Ruby and Sapphire. This is a small fact, but one that I find super interesting. During the name selection screen at the beginning of the game, some of the default names that can be selected are references to themes for Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire being the land and the sea. For the boy character, these include land and sea, and for the girl character, Terra and Marina are options. Not only can this be found in the English versions of the game, but the Japanese versions as well. The male character options include Rikuya, with Riku meaning land, and Kaito, with Kai meaning sea. For the girl character, Mutsumi and Nami are options which refer to land and sea respectively. These references are carried over into other languages as well. The team considered changing core mechanics. As we all know, you can have up to 6 Pokemon in your party at once, and Pokemon can learn up to 4 moves at any given time. However, during development for Ruby and Sapphire, Junichi Matsuda stated in an interview that the team were very much considering changing these mechanics. As the team were viewing Ruby and Sapphire as a bit of a reset for the franchise, the team wanted to make the game stand out, thus considered changing core mechanics in order to achieve this. However, after careful consideration, the team came to the conclusion that the original game's format was best, and ultimately, it would not add to the experience of the games. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. Would you prefer to see a Pokemon game whereby a Pokemon could know, say, 5 or 6 moves at a time? I'm really interested to hear the community's opinion on this. The games could have been sued? One of the major reasons behind why Pokemon became so popular was due to the now famous tagline, "Gotta catch 'em all." It was plastered over every piece of Pokemon merchandise available, it was in the theme song of the anime, and critically, it was on the box art of the games. Fans of the franchise would have noticed, however, that Ruby and Sapphire dropped the tagline and it didn't feature on the box art anymore. Ruby and Sapphire critically were released on the Game Boy Advance, which had no capability of trading with the older Game Boy and Game Boy Color consoles. Critically, what this meant is that all the Pokemon that players caught on the previous generations were now permanently stuck there. In addition, a large amount of Kanto and Johto Pokemon were unavailable, with the games focusing on the new Generation 3 Pokemon. Golan Harris, who was the advertising agency for Nintendo of America at the time, strongly advised of ditching the "Gotta Catch 'em all" slogan as a reason that younger players would feel too daunted by the now 386 Pokemon. Additionally, it's noted in the book Monster Kids How Pokemon Taught a Generation to Catch 'em All by Daniel Dockery that from a legal perspective, the games were unable to use the tagline as at the time it was actually technically impossible to catch them all. The games were based off the island of Kyushu in Japan. It's famously known that each Pokemon region is based off a real-life location. Generation 1 is based off the Kanto region of Japan, Generation 2 is based off Kyoto and Nara in Japan, while Ruby and Sapphire are based off Kyushu, an island in Japan. As the game's new lead director, Junichi Matsuda wanted his first led games to be special. Junichi had fond memories as a child travelling to Kyushu with his grandparents and grew sentimental of the island. Many features of the whole region actually pay homage to Kyushu, such as the volcano Mount Chimney, the coastlines of Slateport, and Sutopolis City being based off Kumamoto. Furthermore, the Hoenn region map is actually rotated 90 degrees relative to Kyushu. How awesome is that? It was the first title to be directed by Junichi Matsuda. As just mentioned, Ruby and Sapphire were the first games to be directed by Junichi Matsuda after Satoshi Tajiri stepped down after the releases of Gold and Silver. During this time, Pokemon was actually in a tough spot. It was knocked down in the ratings for the anime, sales were declining, and merchandise spots on the shelves were being replaced with other media such as Star Wars. Matsuda was under immense pressure during this time, and he talks about how he actually got terrible stomach pains during development and had to go to hospital. I got really stressed out and had to go to the hospital and had some stomach issues. The night before release, I had a dream that it was a complete failure, a total nightmare. Despite this, Junichi steered the team forward and actually managed to finish the games early. On the day of its release, Matsuda went to a video game store. I went into the local shop and saw people lining up to buy it, and I was extremely relieved. The games were going to sell 2.2 million copies within the United States in its first month, and a total of 16 million copies worldwide, making them the most successful titles on the Game Boy Advance, and the third best-selling games up to that point. There is a reference to Junichi Matsuda's daughter. As just talked about, Ruby and Sapphire was Matsuda's first time as lead director for the Pokemon games. 2 months before the release of Ruby and Sapphire, Matsuda's wife gave birth to a girl named Kitty. Right at the end of development, Matsuda put a character in the game who is a reference to his newborn daughter. Kitty can be found in Sootopolis City, where she gives you 2 berries every day. They were the first games to have downloadable content. It's common for games these days to have downloadable content, which can add to the experience of the base game. However, this was actually a totally foreign concept back in the early 2000s. After all, to play Pokemon at least, all you needed was a cartridge and a handheld console. No internet was required in order to play the games. However, back in the early 2000s, Nintendo launched the e-reader, which is an accessory to the Game Boy Advance and allowed users to attach a device to their console that would scan data into the Game Boy Advance with physical cards. For Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, the Eon ticket was a special promotional item, and once scanned through an e-reader would allow players to either capture Latios or Latias, depending on what version of the game they were playing. This instance was actually the first time DLC was available in Pokemon. They were the first games to run at 60 FPS. The Pokemon games aren't really known for their spectacular graphics or clean visual experience. The Generation 1 and 2 games ran at 30 FPS, however Ruby and Sapphire were the first Pokemon games to run at 60 FPS, which carried into the overworld, battles, and operating the menu. What makes this more interesting is that in the subsequent games that came out afterwards, the games ran at 30 FPS, except in some circumstances such as battling in Black and White 2, where the games would run at 60 FPS. However, in the main and continuously, Ruby and Sapphire were the first true 60 FPS Pokemon games. Secret references to Kanto and Johto in Slateport Museum. This is a small fact, but one that I find super interesting. Slateport City is famous for housing the Oceanic Museum. Inside the museum, if you're playing either Ruby or Sapphire, you can expect water samples, one of which is from Kanto and the other is from Johto. And if you go to the top floor of the museum, you can actually see a miniature scale of the SS Anne. Furthermore, the theme for the museum is an arrangement of the SS Anne theme from Red and Blue. Shellos and Gastrodon were planned in Ruby and Sapphire. As we have spoken about right at the beginning of this video, is that there were a ton of unused Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire. However, did you know that Shellos and Gastrodon from Gen 4 were among those who were cut? Back in 07, during the promotion of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Junichi Matsuda stated in an interview, "There's also a Sea Slug Pokemon that we weren't able to put in Ruby and Sapphire that we were able to put in this one, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl." Junichi is obviously referring to Shellos and Gastrodon on this one. It's even theorized by some that these Pokemon had their original east and west forms, with Harlem being split by mainly land on the west and islands and sea to the east. Pretty cool, right? There were plans to expand on weather effects in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Weather effects were initially introduced in Generation 2, however Generation 3 expanded on this, with the games actually revolving around the concept. Weather effects at the time included sun, rain, sand, and hail. However, there were actually plans for one more effect. Plans for a new weather effect were actually found in the tire menu in the German Ruby debug ROM, which our friends at the CuttingRoomFloor explored. Simply referred to as Weather ID4, snow as a weather effect was actually planned. Through this image taken in Little Root Town, the team at the CuttingRoomFloor were actually able to trigger the weather effect, which depicts snowflakes falling to the ground. It's fun to theorize how this actually would have been implemented in the games. They acknowledged the slowdown of the franchise. Ruby and Sapphire represent probably the most pivotal part of Pokemon's history. After experiencing enormous success in Generation 1 and 2 through games, TV shows, card games, merchandise, and much more, in the early 2000s, Pokemon started to decline. While the Generation 2 sales were successful, they proved to sell much less than their predecessors. The anime was falling down in the ratings, and the Pokemon Company ended their partnership with Wizards of the Coast, the makers of the Pokemon card game. Everyone in the media was convinced Pokemon was a phase and it was dying out. The generation who grew up with the previous games were now starting to get older, and if you're at school at the time, you would actually remember that Pokemon was kind of uncool. You were a bit embarrassed to actually admit that you still liked Pokemon. With a new lead director at the helm, Game Freak, Nintendo, and most of all, Junichi Matsuda knew about this. At the time of Ruby and Sapphire, we knew that Gold and Silver had done very well, but there was talk about Pokemon being on a downwards trend, or maybe it was finished. That's the context in which Ruby and Sapphire were being developed. My strongest desire at the time was that I didn't want it to end. I wanted to bring some elements of play that had never been seen before and make great games with the other staff. With this in mind, the games went on to be a massive success and ensure the franchise would remain the global icon that it still is today. Without Ruby and Sapphire, and without Junichi Matsuda, it's hard to see Pokemon making it past 2003. If you think you know everything about Generation 1, then check out the video on screen now where we dive into how a secret island was planned in Kanto, and how the games were almost destroyed before they even launched. Remember to like and subscribe to not miss out on any content.